Yeah. Sorry, I have an unhealthy relationship with caffeine, so I'm not used to sitting down, so I'm going to stand up this morning if that's okay. I get a little too fidgety when I try to sit for too long. But no, this morning is kind of funny for me. I'm a little OCD and a little bit of a routine-oriented person. Anybody else like that? Right? I like lists and I like having a plan and knowing what to do. And this morning I woke up later than normal. I had to take a different route than I would normally take. Just everything for me this morning has been a complete change, and change is weird. And so this morning we're going to talk about the dangers of change, right? Are you anybody else like me where when things don't go according to the way it's supposed to go, you get a little ruffled and you have to make those spur of the moment decisions and just everything kind of changes in the moment. Well, this morning, if you have your Bibles, we're going to get to Exodus chapter 14. I don't specifically have a verse. We're going to go through kind of a couple, but we'll start out in Exodus 14. So while you're turning there, let me give you just a quick little review, if you will, to get the setting here, to know where we're at and where we are. So the Israelites are on their journey now through the desert. Pharaoh has sent the people from Egypt, and they're on their way to freedom. They're on their way out of slavery into this promise. So let's review. They have this guy named Jacob, who was renamed Israel. He has a bunch of sons. And the youngest of his sons is Joseph. Joseph was hated by his siblings, and if you remember, they ended up selling him to an Egyptian for slavery. While in Egypt, a side note to this point, while in Egypt, a situation that they didn't sign up for, a situation that he didn't want to be in, a situation that just kind of happened. While in Egypt, rather than gripe and complain about it, he did the best he knew how. He did all that he could do with integrity. How many of us are now doing the best that we can in the crazy times that we live? How many of us are doing the best we can to stay full of integrity, even in the midst of a world who's telling us we shouldn't? Good little side note to take there. The world we live in now isn't always what we signed up to be or what we signed up for. But this is who we are, right? If we're going to follow Christ, we're called to be full of integrity. So Joseph ends up finding favor in Egypt because of his integrity, so much so that he was promoted multiple times, and he basically becomes like second in command. He becomes in charge of the grain distribution center in all of the land, and Israel in particular, his family, the ones who had mistreated him, had now come to him for food. Kind of a second little question here. How many of us would love the opportunity to get even with somebody that mistreated us? Joseph was cheated out of so much. He lost time. He lost family memories. He was cursed and discarded, and no one. And now, he was cursed and discarded as no one, and now here he is in prime position to get revenge, but he doesn't. Remember, Joseph has this character trait of integrity. Because of this, now they have a big family reunion, and in the end, his family ends up settling in Egypt, where they started to become a little fruitful, and as a people and as a family started growing in numbers, right? Now the Pharaoh, whom had found favor with this little situation, he dies, and Jacob dies, and the new Pharaoh comes into power, and he doesn't like what he sees. The Israelites have grown too big in number and too powerful for Egypt's peace of mind, and the new Pharaoh does not honor the promises of his father, so Israel is forced into manual labor and becomes slaves into Egypt. 400 years later, or 400 years would go by in Egypt as slaves. The people would become very accustomed to their surroundings and very accepting of their conditions, and this was God's people living among a nation who did not acknowledge Israel's God. The people of Israel would try to keep their traditions and their beliefs, and I imagine there were some of those who did. But after 400 years, imagine living with the promise of a deliverer from generation to generation, right? It'd go kind of like, my dad told me that this is going to happen. This person's going to come and he's going to deliver us out and we're going to be set free. My grandpa told my dad this story of one who was going to come. There's this kind of story through my family from great-grandpa, right? And then my great-great-grandpa used to say, people used to say there's this promise And as distance came with the promise, the hope of it actually being fulfilled went with it. Y'all kind of follow me on that? So here we are after generations. Kind of similar to us today, right? Jesus made a promise when he ascended back into heaven that I'm coming back for you. And then I'm sure those guys who heard it and told their kids about it, told their kids about it, told their kids about it. And here we are 2,000 or so plus years later, and we're still waiting on the promise to be fulfilled. And it's kind of turned into, for our culture, unfortunately, the old story, the old myth, the old thing that possibly could be true, right? Very similar to the way Israel was here in Egypt. Even though Israel hated the conditions of Egypt, we will see later in its history account that we're going to look at this morning that they would rather be under Egypt's control than be under God's care when things get a little questionable or even a little bit unbelievable. And so now this generation, where we pick up with this story this morning, had lived to see God fulfill his promise to send a deliverer to free the people from their bondage. And this is where Moses comes in. Moses comes in on the scene. Maybe you've seen the movie at Easter. Moses is called out and told to go to the Pharaoh and tell him to set my people free. Pharaoh refuses. Now the people witness plagues in Egypt, miraculous plagues that would only serve to prove that something bigger is at work than they realize. And they witness God move through Moses as a prophet to the people. They see all these confirming signs and wonders, and they see God, the God of their forefathers, coming center stage, and they even live through the death angel if by trusting God with some crazy request. They were to smear the blood of the sacrificed lamb over the doorpost of their home. And now they're living their wildest dreams, getting to leave Egypt to experience life and to the fullest as free people. Again, very similar to us, right? We're given kind of the same little command, not necessarily to smear literal lamb's blood over our doorposts, but the sacrificed lamb of Jesus Christ to take his blood and mark it over the doorposts of our home, of our lives, right? Here we are in very similar situations, and they were now living in God's promise, right? They were trying to live they weren't trying anymore to live looking forward to a promise. They were now realizing the promise kept. And this was the promise so long ago that God would send a deliverer to take them from Egypt. And here he now was in front of them. And they were on their way. This was the promise fulfilled. So we Christians, we who are actively following Jesus Christ, like Israel, we've been kind of in the same boat in recent years, if you think about it, right? We live in a world that's not our home. It's not where we're supposed to be anymore. We're supposed to be in the kingdom with him. We are surrounded by a world culture that's more and more becoming a culture that screams for God to get out, that screams for God to get away. It's a world that's screaming louder and louder for God to kind of just disappear. If you want to do an interesting study one day, go read through the book of Judges. Judges, we see an account of what happens when people stop listening to God and start doing what they, quote, believe is right in their own eyes. And it's eerie to see the similarities to what America's going through right now. One little act of injustice gets retaliated in a way that they best saw fit, which then gets retaliated again in a way that they best saw fit, which then gets retaliated and escalated until ultimately one little local event turned into a major national war, right? It's a little eerie. Our nation is growing with people who want to become their own authority and push God out. And we're now pretty far removed from the beginning of the promise for us. That is, Jesus promised us that he was going to go away for a season, but he would return again. And for most of us now, it's become kind of the story that we've heard passed down from generation to generation, waiting on it. So what happens to Israel? Why is the Exodus not exactly the full blessing to the people that it should be? This morning, as we look through this text in Exodus, I want to share with you a couple of bad reactions, or for us this morning, a couple of bad habits that I think we tend to have during major life-altering changes. When things start to change, there's a couple of bad habits that I think most of us will struggle with at one time or the other, and we're going to look at it real quick. So Exodus 14, I'll look at verse 10. Exodus 14, verse 10, it says, "As Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they became very frightened. So the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, "It is because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness. Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians'? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." When things start to change a little bit, I think a lot of times we get scared. Fear creeps in. When we don't know what's going to happen around the corner, when we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know about you, but I struggle a little bit sometimes with the fear of the unknown. The people were now living in the promise of God Almighty. They had just lived through the miraculous plagues and walked out of Egypt, formerly slaves, now as a free nation. And they are now, as it says, they look back, and when they look back, they see the former master, if you will, the former way, the former holds in pursuit, and they became very afraid. Was God going to stop holding up his end of the bargain? Was God really going to get him out? Was God going to constantly take care of them? I mean, Egypt wasn't the greatest, but they at least had food every day, somewhat, right? Egypt wasn't the greatest, but at least we had a place to sleep every day. And now here they are out in the middle of nowhere. Things were looking a little dangerous. Things were looking a little uncertain. The people didn't know what was about to happen. And they now had to live by faith. Sometimes we have to walk with God when we don't know what's about to happen. Sometimes we have to walk in faith knowing that He has our best interest at heart. How many people we see come forward in a church or come in for an appointment and they make a public decision to follow Jesus, and weeks go by and everything seems exciting. Man, I see new Christians come forward and they follow through with baptism, and everything starts seeming like it's making sense, and life starts clicking on all cylinders. Many express a feeling of freedom like they haven't felt in a long time, or maybe ever. But at some point, they find their old life or their old masters, their old strongholds chasing after them. And things start to look a little scary. Things kind of become a little uncertain. What do? At some point during the uncertainty, or at some point during the change, we take our eyes off of the one that we should be following, and we start focusing on what's following us. And here lies the first problem. In the student ministry, it's oftentimes friends who come calling for the same old fun that they used to enjoy. And now the students faced with join the crowd and compromise my newfound convictions, or be made fun of, possibly lose some friends, possibly put myself out there into God knows what. For adults, it's the same thing. All of a sudden, someone at work, a few weeks into it, asks us the question, "Man, you seem different over the past few weeks. What's going on? You don't seem to stay around with the same old jokes. You don't seem to stay around when we do what we've always done." Old friends call for the usual invite for the weekend party. You've just gone through a major change, though. Your heart is surrendered to a different heart. What do? It says in verse 10, the sons of Israel looked and they saw the past, and they became very afraid. Fear can make us do things we wouldn't normally do, right? Fear of the unknown, fear of death, fear of failure, fear of being rejected. Fear causes us to make rash decisions sometimes without thinking things through. You ever made a decision out of fear and then look back and went, whoops? Fear can cause us to wall off those around us to protect ourselves. I know during COVID there was a lot of fear of the unknown, and a lot of walls and boundaries were put up that we later learned we maybe not had to put up so great, you know. When fear controls us, it can cause us to stop listening to rationale. I know sometimes when I get afraid, I stop thinking clearly. I start making decisions that I'm like, what'd you do that for, right? Fear has that power sometimes to stop listening to truth, to stop listening to God. One of my big flaws, I think I can confess it to you this morning, is when I get afraid, really afraid, I start trying to do it for myself. I was taught by a dad who taught me to handle the problem, right? To think things through and to be a problem solver and to go out and do it. And sometimes I forget that, hey, God has a plan. And God could probably do it 10 times better than I could do it. But I want to go fix it myself, right? And that's usually when I find doing things in my own eyes, what's right in my own eyes, turns into being not necessarily the best thing. For some of us, we are paralyzed by fear. Sometimes we don't want to move at all. We miss out on things. We can't go talk to that neighbor because what will they say? What if they say no? What if they reject us? We can't teach that class because what if I don't know the answers to all the questions that I get asked? Let me just say that real quick, y'all. I've been a pastor now officially for 14 years, and I've taught through pretty much every book in the New Testament. I don't know half of it. You know what I mean? Like, I get asked questions all the time that I don't know. And that's okay, because I've got mentors in my life that have been in a lot longer than me, and I can say, hey, look, I don't know. I've never been asked that question, but I'll go find out for you. Give me 24 hours, right? And then you go do that. But sometimes people don't want to teach the class, or they don't want to go step in at VBS and lead those groups, or they don't want to take a small group on church because we're just scared we might get asked questions we don't know. Fear can cause us to back out and not jump into what God has really called us to do. Sometimes it's a change of habit, a change of career, maybe a change of a friend group, or a change of just our everyday conversation. We see people all the time who miss out on healing. They miss out on freedom in their lives because we're too afraid to walk towards Jesus, not knowing what the next step's going to look like. They're afraid of what mom would say. You know how many people in our church, on our campus in Addis, they don't follow through with baptism because mama would roll over if they found out they were getting baptized in a Baptist church, right? Sometimes that fear of what our family might think of us stops us from doing what God's called us to do. Oftentimes we miss out on a God-sized blessing because of a human-sized fear. And this morning, that's the first bad habit we're going to look at. Then if you keep reading, bad habit number 2, verse 11. Then they said to Moses, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? Is it not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, 'Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians'? For it would be better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." Bad habit number 2, when things start to change, we start comparing the unknown things to the old familiar way. The way things used to be. Never said that before? I just wish things would go back to the way they used to be, right? Now, we mentioned a few minutes ago, have you ever said that I just wish things were back the way they used to be? If you're a Christian this morning, think about it. The old way for a Christian is most often, if you're growing in your faith, a lesser holy way. The old ways that we sometimes wish things would be like, if you really are a growing Christian, they're a little bit more of the sinful way. It's the old life that we're supposed to be growing out of. And sometimes we find ourselves longing to go back. We long to go back to the past, even though it wasn't always the best place to be. Many young Christians return to their old ways of thinking all the time because it's familiar. It's convenient. It may not have been the most godly way, but it's what I know. It's familiar. It's something that I can control. Or at least we think so. They know it isn't the best life. Most people would admit that they seek and they sought help because they wanted out. But because it's what they know, and it's what's familiar, sometimes for us it's easier to handle the unfamiliar by going back to what's familiar. And we go back to what we know. Walking into a new life, following Jesus where everything changes, sometimes makes all of these habits come in at once. It's fearful. Sometimes we have to do these changes. At least there's something that they know. At least it may not be the best way to be, but there's a comfort in at least thinking that we have some sort of control in it, right? Most of the students at camp, so my last year, a few years ago as the youth pastor, I was taking kids to the same camp for, you guys were with me, about 10 years straight? We went to the same camp for about 10 years straight, and the kids loved it, right? This camp was rocking and rolling. The last couple of years, they just seemed like the camp itself was changing and not for the best for us. So my last year as youth pastor, we decided to change camps. We were going to go to a new camp all around, a new location all around. Everything was going to be different, and I was kind of excited about it. The students, though, if you guys remember correctly, it was a new place, and it was overwhelming for the first couple of days. We had to learn where everything was. We had to get a feel for the whole new layout of the terrain and the school. The schedule was different. Everything looked different, and we even had an extra day than we had in previous years. And some of the students totally missed out on some great times the first couple of days because they were too busy pouting over how much different it was than the other camp. They were too busy complaining about all the ways it wasn't like what they were used to and what they wanted to do. And I believe there are many, many times in our lives today that we miss out on things that could really be great because we're too busy comparing it to the past. Too often, churches miss out on great pastors because it's not Pastor so-and-so. We miss out on great music ministers because they don't do it the way Pastor so-and-so used to do it. We miss out on great things. Sometimes we can really miss out on something amazing God has for us because we're too busy trying to recreate something that he did 15 years ago, or maybe even a week ago. As a pastor, we talk to people all the time for counsel, and for years I've talked with wives who wished everything was different. I've talked to husbands who wish that everything could just change. As a youth pastor, I spoke to kids every day that expressed a desire for everything to just be different. And then overnight, they surrender their life to Christ and everything becomes different. And all anybody could do was wish things would just go back to the normal. The way that's at least comfortable. Why? I believe it's because the way things were was comfortable. It's familiar. We could handle it. Change is hard. Change is different. For most of us, the old ways, at least we learned how to manage it. But we weren't surviving. We were only surviving. We weren't thriving, right? We need to be careful when we experience changes like these that we don't become fearful and start wishing we would be back in the old days. God just might be trying to pull us out of what's comfortable but unfruitful to put us in something that might take time to get used to, but in the end is way more fruitful. Exodus 16, if you'll flip over, jump a chapter, Exodus 16, bad habit number 3. I know nobody in here does this one. Chapter 16, verse 1. They set out from Elim, and the congregation of the sons of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which between Elim and Sinai on the 15th day of the 2nd month, after their departure from the land of Egypt. Verse 2. The whole congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The sons of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill us, this whole assembly, with hunger. Bad habit number 3, we start grumbling about all the things that we don't have. You guys are quiet this morning. Is that anybody else? Is that just me? Start griping and complaining about all the things we don't have. Big life-altering changes can make us take for granted the things that we look forward to, and we focus on all the things that we don't have anymore. The people grumbled because they didn't have sufficient food. Even as God provided food for them, they complained about what kind it was. Kind of sounds like youth ministry a little bit, doesn't it? We don't have sports anymore. We don't have movie theaters anymore. We don't have bars anymore. We don't have lives. Or maybe we could look at it like this. We don't have idols anymore. We don't have distractions anymore. We don't have stumbling blocks anymore. You name it, there's something to be thankful for when our hearts are in the right place. 1 Thessalonians 5:18, it says, in everything, this is God's will for you, in everything give thanks. There's always something to be thankful for. I remember the COVID season when everything went down on shutdown. Now, let me preface this with this. I'm not making light of that whole season. I'm not making light of COVID. I know for a lot of people, getting sick and losing loved ones and all that was a big deal. And I'm not trying to take away from any of the realness of it, right? But for me and my family, COVID was a good way to reprioritize. It was a good way to slow down. It was kind of God's way of saying you have to slow down. We had gotten so busy, and I had strained relationships with my kids where I weren't knowing them as well. I didn't know any of my neighbors, right? We were just so busy all the time that we were missing the people right in front of us. For me, it was a time to slow down and reprioritize. For many, this was a time of rebuilding relationships that had been stressed due to busyness of life. And for many, it's been nothing more than a time of just complaining about wishing things would go back to the way that it was. And too often do we get caught up griping and complaining that things we don't have anymore, especially during major changes. Sometimes we just need to stop and thank the Lord for the fact that we can stop and thank the Lord.
Right.
Sometimes we need to stop and just acknowledge that God is patient above patience. He's gracious above grace, merciful above mercy. Maybe the fact that we can even just know the Lord. Sometimes we take for granted this, right? We know the creator of the universe. And too often this gets stuck on the nightstand or stuck underneath the seat of the car, and then for weeks we don't even remember where we put it. Sometimes we just need to give thanks to the Lord for making himself known to us. Bad habit number 4. Flip over real quick, chapter 17. We get fearful. We start grumbling about things that we don't have. We start losing sight. We start comparing things to the way they used to be. And in chapter 17, verse 1, when all the congregation of the sons of Israel journeyed by stages from the wilderness of sin according to the command of the Lord, and they camped at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people started quarreling with who? Moses. Bad habit number 4. We start to fight with authority. Yikes. We become hard to lead. It's difficult at times to follow authority that we don't agree with, right? I'm not going to take this down a political road, but sometimes it becomes hard to be led by somebody that we don't necessarily agree with, whether it be in our politic realm or our job realm or whatever it is. In Romans 13, it says, everyone must submit to the governing authorities, for all authority comes from God. And those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. So anyone who rebels against authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. Don't like the president? Tough. Doesn't matter. He is. Don't like the mayor? Doesn't matter. He is. Don't like your teacher? Doesn't matter. They are. David had a falling out with King Saul. Saul had become jealous of David, and he pursued him to kill him, and he really had no grounds in which to do it. This was Saul's issue, and it affected David greatly. And David at one point has the opportunity to take Saul out. Saul was hunting him, and he was trying to falsely accuse him of crimes he didn't commit. And in a cave, while he was standing there unsuspecting anything, David is behind him, and he has every opportunity to end this and return home and even claim the crown. You might know where the story goes. What did David do? It says David honored the Lord by allowing the Lord to deal with the authority the way he saw fit. David knew that it was God who called Saul into that position, and it would be God to remove him. David knew it was not his place to correct the injustice of the leader, and I think sometimes we forget that. I think sometimes we overlook that. We think we know better. We used to have this word in the church. I don't think we use it as much anymore, sadly, but when we get pastors into a church, we're not hiring a pastor. It's not a job. In view of a call. Some of you guys might remember that word, right? In view of a call, it means we brought a person in that we've prayed about and we've looked at, and then when we vote yes or no, it's not do we want to hire this person or not. It's an affirmation of do we believe God has called that person to that pulpit or not. And if you said yes, then like King David, we got to remember God put that person there. It is not my job or my role or even my place to say anything different. Don't like the person in charge? It's our role to do what? To pray for them, to come alongside them, to figure out how we can best help and manage and allow them to fulfill the calling of their life. And if they're the ones out of place and not doing what they're supposed to be doing in their calling, God's going to take care of that. You with me? Sometimes things around us would go so much smoother if we would just submit to those in authority around us and work as if unto the Lord. A good verse, if you don't know this verse, it's a good verse to have memorized. Colossians 3:23. It says, whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men. God's going to deal with the unfaithful leader. God will deal with the authority who's unfair and mistreating people. God will remove the leader when the people let God be God. How can we be a follower of Jesus if we're honoring him as the authority of our lives? The whole idea of lordship is to give Jesus complete authority. But when we don't like the way things are being led, we oftentimes want to grumble about it and do it our own way. We don't like the way things are going. I think we have the tendency to take back the authority in our own lives because they can only have that authority if we like the direction it's going. That pastor can be my spiritual authority only if I like every decision and every sermon topic he ever preaches, right? My teacher can have all the authority they want as long as they treat me fair, and if they treat me unfairly, then I don't care what they say. The president can have my authority and respect if the media says nice things about him today. When things around us start to change, if we're honest, I think we tend to struggle with one, if not all of these tendencies. I know I do. It causes us to become controlled by fear, not knowing what's coming. Or maybe we're too distracted to enjoy the change, even if it's for the better, by comparing things to the way things used to be. We would rather be comfortable than uncomfortable. We become grumpy and we complain about everything that we don't have, failing to appreciate the very things that we do have. Or we become prideful and stubborn, and we fail to lift up and to support those around us called to lead. It's way easier to point out the flaws in leadership than it is to stand behind them and help them fix their weak areas, isn't it? It's way easier to demand leaders to be removed rather than encourage them and build them up, to get involved and help become part of the solution. It's way easier to take matters into our own hands sometimes than to just stand back and let God be God. So what's the biggest problem with all of these tendencies? Why is it so bad? Or what's so bad about being human? What could be so bad if we don't guard ourselves from falling into these traps? If you have it, flip over real quick to Numbers. Numbers chapter 14. In Numbers chapter 14, we see the result of Israel's problem because of these tendencies. Numbers 14, verse 30. Surely you shall not come into the land in which I swore to you to settle. Surely you shall not. The ultimate danger of all these tendencies is that if we would ultimately miss out on some of the promises and the inheritances we have through Christ. The people of Israel are banished from the promise because of their own stubbornness, their own hardness of heart. This generation that we're reading about will completely miss out on the promised land and miss out on the reward of obedience because their hearts were never quite fully surrendered to God's promises from the get-go. And sometimes if we let it, I think change can do the same thing to us. This is the point of the letter of Hebrews. If you read Hebrews, this would be the foundation of the letter written to Hebrews, that if we're not careful to mature in our faith, to trust Jesus in obedience, then we can miss out on some of the rewards and inheritances promised. It's not an issue of salvation. We can't lose our salvation if we have it. And let me just say on the side note there, we can't lose our salvation if we have it because we didn't do anything to earn it. How could we do anything to lose it if we didn't do anything to earn it? It's based on Jesus and his promise, right? But if you have salvation, there are promises of inheritances. There are promises of freedom. There are promises that we can walk in that we can lose out on if we get too distracted in our fear, or we get too distracted in the past, or if we get too stubborn in the way of what's being in front of us. So to close this morning, how do we avoid these traps? How do we avoid these bad habits and these bad tendencies? Back in Exodus 14, the first one, fear. Exodus 14:14. It says, the Lord will fight for you while you simply keep silent. How do you overcome fear? It's to trust that the Lord's going to fight for you. When we start becoming afraid of the unknown, stop to think about the promise he gave us to never leave us nor forsake us. If you are his, as we read about, if you are his, he will fulfill his promise. Do you believe that? His promises can override our fears. The second part, comparing things to the old way. Exodus 14, verse 13. But Moses said to the people, do not fear, stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you have seen today, you will never see them again. Comparing things to the old way, when the people were comparing their current situation to the old one, they should have just simply looked at what was really happening. Instead of looking back at what was coming, looked forward at what God was doing. He parted the Red Sea. He led them by a pillar of fire, a cloud by night. But yet they were focused on the enemy army coming up, or they were focused on the lack of food. We need to focus sometimes forward on what God's doing versus what God's not, or at least in our perception. The third thing, complaining about what we don't have, not being grateful for what we do have. Proverbs chapter 30. In Proverbs chapter 30, verse 7 through 9, it says, 2 things I ask of you. Do not refuse me before I die. Keep deception and lies far from me, giving neither poverty nor riches. Feed me with the food that is my portion, that I may not be full and deny you and say, who's the Lord? Or that I may not be in want and steal and profane the name of my God. Knowing that God has our best interests at heart, let me ask you this. Why would God give you something that would steal your heart away from him and cause you to stumble? There's a very, very real reason, and I can acknowledge this morning, I know why God has not allowed me to win the lottery. Right? I mean, I promise I'm going to do all this good stuff with it. I'm going to give it to the church. We're going to build the new building. We're going to move out. But if I win the lottery, I would become totally self-sufficient. I could take care of it myself. My dependency on my God to provide for me would totally go out the window. Money would become the very thing that I put my trust in. So God doesn't give it to me. It's for my best interest, right? We have to trust that God has our best interest at heart. I wouldn't give my 3-year-old certain gifts that I would give my teenager. And some things we're not ready for. Sometimes we don't have what we don't have because of our own good. And the fourth thing, how do you avoid fighting with authority? It's simple. Submit to authority. Lordship really means authority. But lordship means authority in everything. So if I'm obeying my parents, I'm really obeying Christ's command to me. If I'm following my president, I'm obeying God and honoring those positions. I'm not necessarily honoring the person, I'm honoring the position, right? And I'm honoring my God and my Lord's command to me by following those authorities. If I submit to Christ ultimately as authority, it will guide me in all my decisions for the rest of my life. I pray this morning that we can take a few of these lessons from Israel and answer some very important questions in its own right in our own lives. Who is the authority is probably one of the most important questions we could ever ask. See, for me in my life, you're going to hear in a couple weeks when I give my testimony, I was raised in the church my whole life. I was born and raised for 9 months before I could even breathe the air of the world, and I was raised in it my entire life. But I think for me, I was more living off of my parents' faith than mine. For a long time in my life, I was living off of my grandma. I trusted my grandma. Why would she lie, right? And it wasn't until later in my life that I realized I had to make a decision on Jesus or not. For you this morning, that's my challenge. If we struggle with these tendencies, when things start to change, we struggle with just looking to Jesus every day. Maybe today we just need to reevaluate some things. So let's close out this morning in prayer, and then Brother Gary, I'll turn it back over to you guys. Lord, I thank you this morning for your word. I thank you for the example that you've given us throughout history. God, of our own ways and our own tendencies and our own nature. But God, you've given us your ways, your tendencies, and your nature as well. God, I pray that for each one of us in here this morning, we would answer that question in our own heart of who's really in charge, who's really our authority, who are we really submitting to? And that would be the guiding factor of everything we do, Lord, from the way we talk to the way we interact, to the things that we pursue, the things that we invest in. Lord, may it all be honoring to you. And so we give you this day, we give you our hearts and all things in Christ's name, and all God's people said.
Amen.